All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. So I want to welcome everyone back to the final session for today. This has just been a really fun day so far. I appreciate the wonderful talks, but also the robust discussion with the audience afterwards. So I'm sure we'll have more of the same at this session. So today's the final session today is focused on tobacco control and regulatory science. And just like prior sessions, I'm sure you'll hear the cross-cutting themes with behavioral economics and behavioral pharmacology. We have a really excellent lineup. I'm really excited that we have everyone here to talk. So first, we have Dr. Dorothy Hatsukami. Dr. Hatsukami is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Minnesota Medical School and the Forster Family Endowed Chair in Cancer Prevention at the Masonic Cancer Center at the University of Minnesota. Her areas of expertise include nicotine addiction and its treatment and tobacco regulatory science, assessing the toxicity, appeal, and addictiveness of various tobacco products. She has over 500 peer-reviewed publications, edited a book on tobacco and cancer, and contributed to Surgeon General's reports. She has served on numerous scientific advisory boards and councils for the U.S. government agencies, including NIDA, SAMHSA, and ONDCP. Today, she'll be talking about reflections on characterizing the nicotine withdrawal syndrome and its impacts, and hear the cross-cutting themes from John Hughes as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eli, for the nice introduction. Oops, thank you. I'm very short compared to Eli. And so, yeah, this is my talk, and it is a partial tribute to John Hughes, who was such a wonderful colleague, of course, a brilliant colleague, and truly a terrific friend, and I really miss him dearly. So, let me just go back. When Eli gave me this topic to talk on, I was thinking, wow, shouldn't be any sweat. It would be easy. I'll talk about some of the characteristic of the nicotine withdrawal symptom that John and I had explored and give some reflections. But then what happened is I went down a deep rabbit hole. And I have not totally climbed out of it. And so I have more questions than I do reflections. And thank goodness that we have a bunch of brilliant scientists here, and maybe you can answer some of those questions. And of course, my biggest question is, do we really have a grasp or handle on what truly constitutes nicotine addiction? So Rick would be happy to know that I was not a reviewer of his manuscript. So before I go, these are my These are my disclosures funded by NIDA and FDA, and I do some consulting work for Eli Lilly and Antidote Therapeutics. So when I first started my career, which was 40 plus years ago, actually tobacco withdrawal symptoms were what was considered to sustain nicotine addiction. That is, people were thought to smoke because they wanted to avoid nicotine withdrawal. So one of the questions that I had was, well, what can we do to minimize some of the withdrawal symptoms? And so I approached my former graduate school advisor, Roy Pickens, and asked him if we can write a grant together to explore this area. And he said, well, first of all, I want you to meet a postdoctoral fellow, and his name is John Hughes, which was really fortunate set of circumstance that I was able to meet and work with him. And so John and I started digging into the literature to see what kind of ways we can minimize withdrawal symptoms, only to find that there wasn't really that much literature in that particular area. And so we had to answer the question, what are the characteristics of the withdrawal syndrome? And so what we did initially is we did an inpatient study, much similar to the one that was conducted by Himmelsbach on opiate withdrawal. And so we had people in the hospital for a period of a week, and we measured them during baseline smoking, and then we deprived them of cigarette smoking for a period of 4 days and gave them a real comprehensive set of withdrawal measures. We measured everything except for collecting their poop and urine, which I think some centers, maybe Columbia does that, I don't know. But anyway, and we found that there were indeed some withdrawal symptoms. People felt dysphoric. They also had poor performance on tasks. We also found sleep disturbance. And then we found that they increased their caloric intake and as a result had increased their weight. But we were really surprised that the number of symptoms that we found were not that many, and also the intensity was not that great. So fortunately, it was at that time that that nicotine gum, when Mary Merrill Dow wanted to introduce nicotine gum into the marketplace in the US. So they wanted to test the safety and efficacy of nicotine gum. And they had approached us to ask us if we would want to test the safety or the effects of nicotine gum on nicotine withdrawal symptoms. And so what we did is we did a study where we compared nicotine gum versus placebo. And within the placebo gum, we would be able to take a look at what are some of the characteristics of the nicotine withdrawal syndrome. And there, indeed, we found an expanded number of withdrawal symptoms, and they tended to be a little bit more severe than what we had found in the inpatient unit, which, brings us to the whole idea that environment really does make a difference. That's what Wickler had talked about when he was looking at conditioned effects of opiate withdrawal. So in the context of doing that study, what we found is that nicotine gum does suppress withdrawal symptoms, which was really good news. That meant that, people who quit smoking didn't have to feel so miserable because nicotine gum would help. But it also showed that nicotine was one of the effective agents in terms of what might be the etiology of the withdrawal symptoms. We also subsequently did a study looking at the effects of lower or reduced nicotine content cigarettes and determining what kind of impact that would have on withdrawal symptoms. And there we also found that it suppressed withdrawal symptoms. So, that showed that the sensory effects of smoking also has a role in terms of the withdrawal symptoms, reducing withdrawal symptoms. So John and several others, Steve Higgins is one of the authors on the paper that was published in the 1990s, where we wanted to take a look at whether all abstinent effects weren't in truly withdrawal symptoms. We didn't think that they were all withdrawal symptoms. And so we classified the true withdrawal effect being one where you see the symptoms being bidirectional. That is, you see an increase or a decrease and then a decrease, or you see a decrease and then an increase. So an example of that would be something like anxiety. You would see an increase and then a decrease. Something that was like heart rate, you'd see a decrease, but then you would see an increase. So that was classified as being a true withdrawal symptom. Now, you might also see an offset effect. And what that would mean is that it was a unidirectional effect where you might see just a sustained increase or sustained decrease. So an example of that might be something like increased weight. And then there was the indefinite effect, and that was one where there wasn't enough data to know whether it was either a withdrawal effect or an offset effect. Well, John subsequently went on, John and a number of colleagues went on and had conducted this extensive review of what are the symptoms that could be classified as true withdrawal symptoms. And so this is what he found. And most of them are the ones that are in the DSM-5, except for, I think, impatience is included in here, which the DSM-5 doesn't include. And so you can see a number of the negative affect symptoms are included in here. Restlessness, which is more of a behavioral effect, difficulty concentrating, as well as insomnia. What John did not do is he didn't look at hunger or performance decrements or craving. But in my opinion, I think that they should be included. One of the symptoms that you clearly see as a withdrawal effect is decreased heart rate. You see a decrease and then an increase. Increased appetite as well as hunger and increased weight. I think the reason why he didn't include them was because it might just be an offset effect and not necessarily true withdrawal. Although in some individuals, you do see a decrease over time. And then craving, it may not be the typical pattern of a true withdrawal effect, that sometimes people have high craving at baseline, but then decreased craving, and that decrease is sustained. So those were considered true withdrawal effects. And then he also found some possible withdrawal symptoms. And he included a number of physical symptoms that included things like constipation, cough, and dizziness, and so on. And I know people ask me at times, well, you know, the nicotine withdrawal syndrome symptom checklist, you have the basic ones, but then all of a sudden you have all these physical symptoms. Why is that? Why did you include that? And I think the reason why John included it is because he wanted to know whether, in fact, these are true withdrawal effects. And so if you have an opportunity to use the nicotine withdrawal syndrome, then or symptom scale, then it would be really important to include him to see whether, in fact, these are withdrawal effects. In addition, there are some other symptoms that were considered possible withdrawal, and they include anhedonia, which I think might be a really important symptom to include, primarily because we know that, as we talked about before, that nicotine seems to enhance the value, the reinforcing value of other reinforcers, something that Eric Donny had worked on, and Tony Kajula. And so anhedonia might be a very important one to look at. And John talked about anticipatory anhedonia and consumatory anhedonia. And anticipatory anhedonia is wanting a reward, whereas consumatory is more liking a particular reward. Another one would be impulsivity, and he looked at symptoms of impatience, as well as delayed discounting and response inhibition. And what he found in that particular review is that impulsivity did show true withdrawal effect, but the delayed discounting and response inhibition, it was really uncertain in terms of whether that is a true withdrawal or some other abstinent effect. And then finally, one that Eli actually had worked on was looking at decreased positive affect. And positive affect meaning a pleasant and enthusiastic state of being, something that Jack Henningfield is known for. You want to be around people like that. Anyway, and so, that might be also a possible withdrawal effect. So why is it that withdrawal symptoms are really important? In one of the reviews that John did, he found that about 50% of the population of people do experience, people who are smoking do experience withdrawal symptoms. And this is a study actually that was done in China, but I thought, well, pretty much it aligns with what John was talking about, and that was that about 60% of current smokers report experiencing at least one symptom of withdrawal during the time that they quit, or even if they hadn't quit, and then about 40% of people that had quit do experience withdrawal symptoms. So, in other words, a significant number of people do experience withdrawal. The other factor is that withdrawal is related to relapse. And what's been shown repeatedly is that craving is related to relapse, probability of relapse, as well as negative affect. And this is a real good illustration of a study that was done by Saul Schiffman, where he looked at using ecological momentary assessment, and finding that events that are associated with negative affect prior to relapse tend to increase, but other events that are not associated with negative affect, they didn't really increase prior to lapse. What we haven't really consistently found is that total withdrawal symptoms are related to lapse or relapse. And potentially one of the reasons why is because we don't look at the heterogeneity of the relapse, of the withdrawal experience. And so this is a study that McCarthy has done looking at what the withdrawal symptoms were on a during the course of time. And what he found is that, yes, indeed, if you do plot the means, then you do see an increase. And that increases, in this particular case, its craving is sustained over a few days. Whereas if you really look at the individual data, there's a lot of heterogeneity that the mean value doesn't necessarily represent what's happening to a lot of people. And in fact, people like Piasecki, for example, said that what we should be looking at is the peak intensity of the withdrawal, as well as the duration of the withdrawal and the trajectory of the withdrawal. And you can see that in this particular PowerPoint, where what he did is he looked at three groups of people who smoke, and he divided it up into matched abstainers. So he matched them to the people that had prolonged lapse, which means that they lapsed and then they relapsed to cigarette smoking, and then temporary lapse, which means that they lapsed, but they never got into becoming a regular smoker again. And what the dark line shows the matched abstainers, and you can see that for that group, over time, you can see that during baseline, which is the first panel, there's low symptoms, but when they first quit smoking, you can see that the symptoms increase, but it was not as much as one of the protracted lapsers, which is in the dashed line, the long dashed line. And then if you go further, just prior to relapse, you can see that whereas the matched abstainers, their withdrawal symptoms were kind of a down trajectory. With the protracted lapsers, the withdrawal symptoms just kind of sustained itself. It was higher intensity. So, I think that just goes to show that we really do need to look at individual differences, and potentially, if we look at that, then total withdrawal scores might be related to relapse. Okay, I can't see that far, so 5 minutes. All right, great. So, basically, we've been focusing on withdrawal symptoms, but we know that there are some positive reinforcing effects from actually smoking, as well as demonstrated from some of the work that Jack has done. So, the question is, what if we tackled some of the positive reinforcing effects, as well as reduce the occurrence of withdrawal symptoms? And of course, that led us and Steve Higgins and Eric, my research partner in this area, to take a look at reduced nicotine content cigarettes. And so with that, what we see is we do see a reduction in abuse liability, of course, using a number of different measures. And we see a reduction in abuse liability that includes a reduction in the self-administration of cigarettes, which is really good. And we also see a reduction in dependence as well. Not only do we see a reduction in dependence, we see a reduction in the occurrence of withdrawal symptoms, and that's what I want to focus on. So this is a study that Eric led. It's the one where we took a look at different various doses of nicotine content cigarettes. And what I want you to focus your attention on is the lines that have the open circle, which is the 0.4 milligram dose of nicotine content, and the blackened circles, the filled circles, which is the 15.8 milligram, which is the normal nicotine content group. And this is a study that occurred over a period of 6 weeks. And what you can see is that in the first figure, you can see what happens to the total withdrawal scores, and there are no significant differences in terms of the increase in withdrawal between the 0.4 and the 15.8. So the withdrawal symptoms are pretty minimal. Now, it's a little bit different than some of the other studies that we've conducted, where you do see an increase in withdrawal, but usually the withdrawal symptoms tend to be transient, and they tend to be mild. In the right panel, what you see is the effects on the questionnaire and smoking urges. And what you see in that particular figure is that there's a reduction in the QSU factor 1 score. And factor 1 score is the one where you're anticipating the pleasurable effects of, urges that are associated with anticipating the pleasurable effects of smoking. And you can see that there's a reduction among those who are provided with a 0.4 milligram dose of nicotine versus the 15.8. So you don't see very much withdrawal symptoms when you give people very low nicotine content cigarettes, and you see a decrease in urge to smoke related to factor 1. Now, the brilliant thing that Eric had decided to do is to see what happens when you take them off the cigarettes, after they've been on these cigarettes for a period of 6 weeks. And so this is a figure that shows the smoking urges questionnaire, but it was pretty similar to what you saw with the withdrawal symptom score. That is that people who went off the 0.4 milligram dose of nicotine, there was minimal withdrawal compared to the 15.8 milligram dose. So minimal withdrawal when you're going off the cigarettes. And this is the smoking urges, the factor 1 as well as factor 2. Factor 2 is related to smoking urges related to the relief of withdrawal symptoms. And again, you see a decrease with the 0.4 milligram dose compared to the 15.8. So this is where I got into the rabbit hole. See, so you have this product. It's reducing the positive reinforcing effects of nicotine. You know, people hate the cigarettes. You know, they don't find them pleasurable. Really low abuse liability. You're reducing the experience of withdrawal when they switch over to this product. And when they get off the product, they're hardly experiencing any withdrawal symptoms. So why is it that so many people continue to use the very low nicotine content cigarettes? I mean, we do see an increase in terms of cessation rate by threefold among people who are assigned to the very low nicotine content versus the normal nicotine content. But, you know, significant portion, the majority keep on smoking. Why is that? Is it because of the learning process, the associative learning process that we've been hearing about? You know, do they still have sustained cue reactivity? Is it because they are provided intermittent reinforcement, primarily because many of these people are cheat sometimes. You know, they go into the real environment and they use the normal nicotine content cigarettes. They intermittently use them. And so is that what's just sustaining their use of the very low nicotine content cigarettes? You know, certainly there was a study that was done, secondary analysis that was done by Sarah Dermody, who showed that if you have low levels of nicotine, then you're more likely to be abstinent. So is that the reason why? Is it because the cigarettes, normal nicotine content cigarettes are accessible? They're available in the marketplace. And so, you know, they can, you know, certainly go out anytime and they know that, you know, at the end of the study, they can go out and buy these normal nicotine content cigarettes. We did an analysis of people. We surveyed them and asked them what would happen if the very low nicotine content cigarettes that they've been exposed to were the only cigarettes that were available to them, and 50% said that they would quit smoking. Okay, that's far more than what we observed. So, you know, is it the lack of availability of cigarettes that would actually increase the rate of quitting? Or is it the cost? You know, most of these studies we do, we give the cigarettes for free. And so if there's cost imposed on it, will they in fact reduce, will they quit smoking, essentially? So, you know, or is it, you know, some negative reinforcing effect that just kind of sustains itself, you know, the memory of it sustains itself as a result of the negative reinforcing effects from the sensory properties of cigarette smoking? Or is it that we really don't know the answers to the question yet? Is there some internal process, interceptive cues or whatever that we're missing? So that's how I got into the rabbit hole. I haven't gotten out of it. And I wished I had my colleague John Hughes to talk to, you know, about this, these questions that have arisen. But the good thing is we have a whole new, younger generation of people that might address this question. And of course, we have all of you too. I mean, you know, it really is wonderful to have all this talented scientists in this room, and perhaps you have some of the answers to these questions. So thank you for your attention, and sorry for going over time.
Thanks for that fantastic talk and thought-provoking questions there. Next up, we have Dr. Eric Donny. Dr. Donny is a professor of translational neuroscience and social sciences and health policy and the founding director of the Tobacco Control Center of Excellence and program co-lead for cancer prevention and control at Wake Forest School of Medicine. He has published over 200 scientific articles on nicotine, tobacco, and addiction, and is a fellow of both the Society for Research on Nicotine, Tobacco, and the American Psychological Association. His work focuses on behavioral, pharmacological, and neurobiological mechanisms underlying nicotine use and dependence. He co-directed the Center for Evaluation of Nicotine in Cigarettes, or CNIC, which is a NIDA FDA-funded specialized center. Dr. Donny also co-directs an NCI-funded PO1 aimed at understanding the potential impact of vaping nicotine on adolescent health and well-being.
Hi, everybody. So it's always great to follow Dorothy because she stole like half my points. So like I'm gonna be fast. Let me make one. So it really is, as everybody has kind of commented on, an honor to be here. I look around the room and I also think about John and Warren and how much they impacted my career, my life. And so grateful for them, but also grateful for a lot of people in this room. And I'm going to call out a few people. So Maxine, who was one of my mentors at Hopkins, Sharon, who was my other mentor at Hopkins, primary mentor, people like Jack and Steve, and obviously Dorothy, who really taught me, I feel like, how to be a translational scientist and how to use the principles that we've been talking about today about behavioral pharmacology and behavioral economics, how somebody from a rat lab, and I spent all my hours sitting in not sitting personally in an operant chamber, although it felt like that in graduate school sometimes, but working in an operant space, in an operant chamber, can meander his way to thinking about policies. And I really do attribute that kind of broad thinking to those folks, and I appreciate their mentorship and friendship. Before I get started, obviously want to thank, I think in these days, particularly thank NIH for funding over the years. I don't have any conflicts of interest that are relevant to disclose. And I've put a laundry list of people, and then I stopped there because that also is a rabbit hole for me of people to thank. But thank you all for being such partners. So where I want to start today is kind of three principles that are really critical and guiding principles for me when I think about this concept of nicotine reduction or nicotine product standards. And that the first is really that all conversations to me have to start with the recognition that we have a product on the market that's available all over the place that is the most lethal product that's probably currently sold on the marketplace. It kills about a third to a half of all people who continue to use it. There is no other product like that. And so any conversation around policy, any conversation around scientific impact has to start with that as the foundation of a discussion. And that's been known we've had this product around for over 100 years. It's been known that it's deadly for well over 60, and was captured well in the 1964 Surgeon General's report, which called for remedies. It called for action. And here we are in 2025 with the same product. And despite, I wasn't Rick's reviewer either, but despite that, reviewers, it's not a problem that is in our past yet. So our target has to be the cigarette. The second thing I want to remember is that the devastation caused by cigarettes is not simply a product of its toxicity. Obviously, that's critically important. We have lots of toxic products out there. The problem is the way it combines with addiction. That harm comes from the product of toxicity and use, and those two things are equally important. You can have a toxic product, but if people can walk away from it because they know it's toxic, then it's a different threat than one in which they are persistent users because of the way it changes their brain. So addiction is critical to understanding harm. And I think the essence of addiction is really nicely captured in Nora's quote here, that when we think about something like free will, what drugs do is they disrupt your ability to have it. That's the core of addiction. So when we think about policies like nicotine reduction, part of the way I'm thinking about it is giving back free will, not taking away choice. The third thing, and this is really in some ways become the most important one, I was talking with Joe Gitchell about this earlier, is that time matters. So I've been having this conversation about nicotine reduction for 15 years or so, and along the time, people continue to die in mass numbers. And so when we as academics review our data and our literature and we try to talk about what to do, that's a great academic and important process. But it has costs. Inaction has cost, just like action has cost. And we have to think about both sides of that. So I want to challenge us to really reflect on this issue of time and decisions when we think about regulatory action. Okay, so research dating back well over a century, right, has documented the importance of nicotine in cigarettes. In the 1988 Surgeon General's report that Jack went over, and some of the history around the early 90s and FDA's initial attempts to regulate cigarettes as a drug device. We've known that that nicotine is central to what drives cigarette smoking for a long time. That really came to into focus in 2009 when the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act was passed and gave it regulatory authority to the FDA after the many years of trying that had failed. And what that did is opened up a lot of doors, a lot of tools that we could use to regulate tobacco products, one of which was to set upper limits on the amount of nicotine, as we've already heard about today. That took a first step forward in 2018 in an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. For those that don't live in this space, this is essentially the FDA saying, hey, we intend to do something. Here's some of our initial thoughts. Tell us what you think to the public. It's kind of the first step that has to be taken in a regulatory action like that. The comments were all taken in. There were tens of thousands of comments, many of which were just photocopied letters from different tobacco distributors, but a lot of interesting things as well. And then earlier this year, they took the next step, the FDA did, called a notice of proposed rulemaking. This gives a little more specific information about what they intend to do, what the plan is. And then that closed just a few weeks ago. And the next step in this process of reducing nicotine in cigarettes is potentially a final rule. That is a rule that says this is what we're going to do and when it starts. The timeline for that we do not know, and certainly a lot of research has gone into that, and a lot of different kinds of research are relevant to this whole process. But it's a long, slow process, and that's where we are. So we're in this NPRM phase. We've just closed this, and just to hit a few highlights of what the proposed rule or the notice of proposed rule lays out. It sets a limit of nicotine, and the limit they picked was 0.7 milligrams per gram of tobacco, and you'll see I'll talk a little bit about the dose in a bit. It lays out that this should be done rapidly, not slowly, in what we call an immediate reduction. It includes cigarettes, but also cigarette tobacco, roll your own tobacco, most cigars, not all, and pipe tobacco in the product standard that they want to propose. It excludes premium cigars, heat not burn products, water pipe, e-cigarettes, smokeless, and oral nicotine products. So some things are under the rule, some things are left out of the rule, and that's very intentional, and we can unpack that if we want. And then the effective date would be at least 2 years after the proposed rule or the final rule is published. So we're talking about at least 2 years from at least a couple of years from now, plus lawsuits and all that. Okay. Putting all that aside, they give you a sense of where we stand. What I want to talk about today, and I've given talks here before, and people have probably seen a lot of the data that I'm going to show, but I want to take a bit of a different look. I want to talk about what to expect, what we can reasonably expect from a nicotine product standard should it go forward. And to me, this question is a really important one because I feel like we're stuck. We're stuck between science and action. We are stuck in that final translational challenge of When should we move forward? How much confidence do we need to do so? And to me, that is a really uncomfortable space. We're scientists. We love randomized clinical trials. We love experimental control. Like I said, I grew up in an operant box, so I like it too. But the real world doesn't look like that. And so how do we take the data we have, and when do we decide it's enough to move forward? So we recently published a JAMA commentary that reflects on this. I think what I'd like to do is get us all thinking more about this translation. So to do this, our predictions need to be data-driven. We need to live in a world where, right now we live in a world where people have really strong opinions. And I think Caroline or somebody mentioned this earlier. We all often think we already know the answer before we see the data. And what we need to do is constantly be reflecting on these big picture questions and ask ourselves, what do the data tell us? How confident are we? How much risk are we willing to take, right? So for something like, does nicotine reduction increase or change the frequency or intensity of smoking, we might have some prediction. You might put my arrow there. Then I collect some data, and then I say, maybe it's down here, right? I adjust my estimate based on data, and then I say, I'm not 100% sure what's going to happen, so I have some confidence interval around that, and I have some sense of that, right? This is the thinking we need to do, and we need to be transparent and honest about where we are if we want to move forward. So I'm going to use this framework to talk about data today. So I'm going to talk about these 5 kind of areas or domains. What does nicotine reduction do to the frequency and intensity of smoking, smoking cessation, unintended consequences, smoking initiation, and demand for illicit products? And I've put them all on a scale from like the worst case scenario, like nobody quit smoking, to the best case scenario, like everybody quit smoking. And then we're going to kind of just do a check on where we are in this. Okay, so to make this more fun, we're going to do audience participation. So how many people think that the frequency and intensity of smoking increases when you give people reduced nicotine cigarettes? Denise, cheater. He knows all this. So very common for people to predict that it's going to increase. And what we're going to do is take a look at data and see how true that is. So here's a couple of early studies. I pulled the one on the left because I'm pretty sure these are data I collected at BPRU at Hopkins. I think this was my first grant. And I'm sure that Maxine and Sharon covered the cost of this because it was an inpatient study that I funded on an RO3. So I'm positive that that was not possible. And I thank you both for supporting me financially. So this was a study where we brought people into the unit. We gave them low nicotine or denicotized cigarettes or regular cigarettes, or they didn't smoke at all. And what you can see is that they decreased their smoking under these controlled conditions while they're staying on the unit. The same is true in outpatient studies. That's Dorothy's study on the right. You can see a decrease in the number of cigarettes over the course of a 6-week clinical trial. The study on the left here is the one that Dorothy introduced earlier. This is essentially the dose response curve for nicotine in cigarettes. If you get the dose to 2.4 milligrams per gram of tobacco or less, we see a reduction in the number of cigarettes smoked per day compared to usual brand or normal nicotine controls. Again, a decrease, not an increase. The study on the right is the one conducted here in Vermont, Steve's group. I love putting these two side by side. Steve likes it too because it shows how much control over behavior drug can have. They look like they're the same study plotted twice, but they're actually in totally different places. I promise you, where I work is nothing like the beauty of Vermont sometimes. So, really replicable dose-dependent effects. We've seen this same sort of decrease when we do more real-world practical studies. This is a study that Dorothy led recently where we gave people alternative products. It was open label. And again, we see a decrease in the number of cigarettes smoked per day, not an increase. So why is it that people think that low nicotine cigarettes should increase behavior? Well, it's because of analogy. And I want to warn us about analogies in science. They're very misleading. You have to ask, why is it functionally related? Not does it appear to be related? And so we think compensation will happen because it did with light cigarettes. When you ventilate a cigarette, people draw harder, they smoke more, they block the ventilation holes. But those cigarettes have just as much nicotine in the rod as a regular cigarette. This is a totally different kind of product. This doesn't have the nicotine in the rod, and you can't compensate for it easily. And so our perceptions, our myth, is that they should compensate, but the data suggests something else, right? Very clearly. And so that's because we estimated the nicotine delivery based on machines, not human behavior, and the product was quite different. And people could do things like this, smoke a pack of cigarettes at once, right? And in theory, you could do that, but the problem is the cigarette smoke is pretty toxic and no one's going to smoke 20 cigarettes at a time. Maxine did some great studies on rapid smoking. It's so aversive, it stops people from smoking. So there's an upper limit here. So we don't see compensation. And in fact, when we've looked at compensation lots of ways, we don't see it. The compensation index from a hotel study we ran is on the left. And then on the right is another set of data from a biomarker from Dorothy's study. The only time we see it, and Donny already tipped this answer, is when we look at intermediate doses. If we reduce nicotine a little bit, like by a third instead of by 95%, then yes, people try to smoke more. But if you get down lower, they just can't get there from here. And so it's not functional. They don't do it. So this is a quote from one of our participants that I think is very telling. I'm going to use these a fair amount. What my thoughts were and what the reality was two totally different ideas. My thought was that they were going to be nasty. You're not going to even taste anything. I'm going to smoke like a freight train and try to make up for the nicotine in my body is craving. And it ended up, it didn't even come out that way. And to me, this is critical. If you give people a hypothetical task, they think they're going to smoke more, but they don't. Okay, so they have to experience it. And this is a situation where I think we have to realize that hypothetical questions don't always work until you experience it. So we have to sort out facts and myths here, and hopefully I've convinced you what direction I think the facts go. Okay, smoking cessation. What actually happens here? So how many people think that nobody's going to quit smoking? How many people think everybody in these trials is going to quit smoking? How many people already know the answer because Dorothy told you about 10 minutes ago? All right, well, what does the NPRM predict? The modeling, population level modeling that's been done predicts that about 12.9 million people in the US will quit smoking in the first year that this product standard is enacted, and 19.5 million within the first 5 years. There's about 28 million smokers. We're talking about a huge mass cessation, right? Is that realistic? Well, what's that based on? So part of it is, again, based on data we've seen. Dependence goes down. When people smoke low nicotine cigarettes, they report fewer symptoms of dependence. These are just two different scales from two different studies showing that dependence is lower in those that are immediately reduced to the lowest levels of nicotine. Our participants tell us things like this. And so I've been able to cut down on smoking. I don't seem to be as needy on the cigarettes. I'm fine. I actually finally feel like the cigarettes aren't controlling me. They also do things like spontaneously don't smoke. So these are the number of days that people just didn't smoke in Dorothy's study. And they just, if they've been on the low nicotine cigarettes, there are some days they just don't smoke at all. Now that may not be a quit attempt, but I do think it's important behavior. And these are the data that, again, that Dorothy talked about earlier. I'll show them to you here. When we ask people at the end of these trials, if this was the only product you had, what do you think you'd do after a year? And this is what they tell us. About half of them say, I would stop smoking. Notice how small the black, solid black is. That's the number of people who say they would smoke more. And in honesty, we never even see that in an objective measure. We can't see anybody who really smokes more. So most people either say they're going to quit or they're going to smoke less. Another quote, it makes me want to just go ahead and put them and quit, put them down. And then data on the right are biochemically confirmed 7-day point prevalence abstinence in the 12-week trial that Dorothy ran, where people had alternative products as well as were randomized to low nicotine cigarettes. And what you can see is that if you're randomized to a low nicotine cigarette, by the end of the 12 weeks, you've got an abstinence rate in that group of about 20%. Now that leaves 80% still smoking, right? Or doing something, right? But that is still 20% of people who were not looking to quit in 12 weeks. And that odds ratio of about 3 is what we see across other trials as well. So clearly there's evidence of cessation. Now, how do we make the prediction of what's going to happen if this moves forward? Well, we've got 20% quitting at the end of 12 weeks, and we have a modeling figure of 12.9 million out of 28 million in the first year. I would argue that we're not that far off of the data in front of us in terms of that modeling prediction. That is, this is a 12-week trial that ends with no other real support to move that policy forward or enable cessation. If we can get to 40% cessation in a year, which is about what that is, that's not that different than the trial predictions. Now, it's a fair question of where this estimate is, how confident you are, but I'm pretty confident the cessation goes up, not down. Okay, worsening of symptoms, audience participation. How many people think people are going to really suffer a lot with low nicotine cigarettes? God, you guys are no fun. How many people think they're really going to suffer? Not at all. They're going to have it easy. No one votes for anything. No audience participation. Okay. Oh, you can't even see it here, but there is a withdrawal there, which is just, I promise you, it's not that much. We see withdrawal in the first week or so of switching to VLNCs, and then it really subsides. We don't see much withdrawal. These are some of the quotes from people about withdrawal or unintended consequences. I'm definitely more agitated or irritated. I'm not freaking out. I'm not upset. I'm not depressed. I feel fine. I kind of feel tired, kind of drained. I wouldn't have said that I've had any mood changes or mood swings or nothing like that. And maybe if anything, I'm a little bit more hungry. Mood and behavior, I don't think anything has changed. The cigarette itself or the lack thereof hasn't really changed my emotions or anything like it. Normal. I mean, I really haven't noticed any physical or mental things. We see some people tell us that they're a little bit off, and we've done inpatient studies or studies in a hotel. I've seen a couple of people come through that struggled more than others, but by and large, it's mild. And probably manageable with other sources of nicotine. Things like depression, the graph to focus here is really the one on the right. These are people with elevated CESD scores at baseline who are then randomized to the VLNC or NNC groups. And what you see is not an exacerbation of symptoms of depression, but a reduction in depression of those that are randomized to low nicotine cigarettes. And that's consistent with what we know about cessation and improvement in some psychiatric symptoms. Jen Tidy and others, Diane Galima and others have done a lot of work in this area, showing that we don't see a lot of unintended consequences. And almost equally, arguably equally important, we see benefits. So it's easy to focus on the potential harms, but the reality is the biggest potential harm in people with psychiatric disorders is the continued smoking, right? And so we have to attend to that, and they also seem to benefit. Okay, how about kids? I'll spoil this one because no one's playing. Smoking initiation, how many kids are going to become smokers? The modeling estimates that by 2100, 48 million youth and young adults who would have become habitual smokers will not. Well, that's a grand number too. I don't know how to do this one well. I can't get IRB approval, nor will I ask for a randomized clinical trial to test this idea that we can avoid nicotine dependence on cigarettes by randomizing kids to low nicotine versus normal. But we can pull from other data sources. And so again, we're here talking about fundamental principles. The animal lab is a great place to look for this. We can understand the functional relationship between dose and behavior, both in adults who have acquired the behavior and you lower it versus adolescents who are acquiring the behavior at a lower dose. And what we see is that if you give adolescent animals exposure to low doses that don't maintain behavior in adults, they also don't acquire as adolescents. And so that gives me some confidence that it's likely to unlikely to lead to acquisition if you reduce, the dose enough. Rachel Cassidy at Brown has really led efforts in young adults who are smokers and trying to understand maybe in those young adults who have less experience, is there a different effect? And by and large, what she sees is that the effects seem to be replicable in young adults. And if anything, they might happen a little bit faster. That is, their behavior might be a little easier to disrupt, which wouldn't be all that surprising. Okay, the biggie, and I know I'm getting close on time. I'm like Dorothy, I'm going to be long, is illicit. Illicit cigarettes are going to be a challenge that we're going to worry about for sure, and we should expect that. These are products that people don't like as much as the predicate product. And so we know that when we ask them, how satisfying is it? They say it's less satisfying than the regular cigarettes. Not surprising, that's kind of the point. We also know that they cheat, as Dorothy referred. In some of the trials, maybe 2/3, 3/4, a half of participants use regular cigarettes when they're randomized to the low nicotine ones. So cheating is a problem, or non-adherence is a problem. The big question is, how much does non-adherence actually predict illicit? Because it's very easy for us to look at those data and say, oh my God, it's going to be a massive illicit market. But that assumes that cheating in this context predicts illicit use in a real world context. And what context are we talking about? Because that depends on other policies and decisions. I would say that these products, as Dorothy said, people do continue to use. So it's not like they're not viable. People use them for weeks on end, and that's true across studies. What will probably matter is whether or not they can substitute other products. And so some of the work done here in Steve's lab shows some really nice data around the appeal of alternative products, how appealing an e-cigarette is an important determinant of how many VLNCs or cigarettes that somebody uses. And Eli just published a really nice mediation analysis showing that those who are assigned to VLNCs and pick up e-cigarette use, increase their frequency of e-cigarette use, are most likely to decrease their cigarette use. So we need to think about that kind of pathway of further driving down smoking through alternatives. The last thing I'll just say is this concept of prohibition is often brought up when we talk about illicit. It's very easy to bring up kind of memories of the 1920s and think this is another form of prohibition. These are data from a study, an analysis that Neil Benowitz just finished up, a secondary analysis of one of our studies, showing that, and what I've circled there is the percentage of nicotine that's been replaced in people who have been given VLNC cigarettes and either have switched completely to alternative nicotine products or are dual using. And you can see they're maintaining their nicotine levels relative to baseline. So they're titrating. There's no nicotine prohibition here. It's just the source of the nicotine is moving. Okay, so the issue then is not prohibition or not, it's not illicit or not, it's how do we set up an environment, a context that moves people in the right direction when there's multiple behaviors or choices they can make. And then the last thing I'll say about illicit is it's not just about demand, it's about lots of other things. It's about supply, access, characteristics of the product, user issues. And so we published a paper with Kurt Ribisel talking about the potential determinants of illicit cigarette use. Okay, so one man's opinion, just mine. This is where I'd put my arrows and my bars. But what I want to challenge you is not to mimic mine, but to make arrows, to not stop it. You have to make a prediction and decide if you think it's enough. Otherwise, we just stay in a state of not translating science to policy. So thank you.
Okay, our final talk for the day is from Dr. Justin Strickland. Dr. Strickland is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Strickland's program of work focuses on developing novel interventions for substance use and substance use disorder using translationally relevant designs. His research applies behavioral economic methods to evaluate choice and decision-making mechanisms that may underlie substance use and identify targets for their reduction. Today, Dr. Strickland will be talking about evaluation of the e-cigarette withdrawal syndrome.
No, we were just talking about, it was refreshing not having the like straight into the talks. So thanks everyone. I've been meaning to, I've told Steve, I've told others that I've been meaning to come up to this conference for years, haven't made it. So hopefully this is the kickstart to getting it into the rotation of things. The lake is gorgeous. Please go out there. I don't know how you could come up here without having walked along the path there. So I'm going to sort of follow up Dorothy and Eric's talk talks today to talk a bit about some ongoing work that we have looking at the e-cigarette withdrawal syndrome, really borrowing heavily from work that both John and Warren did. And so I'll try to emphasize that throughout the talk today. Briefly, my disclosures, nothing relevant to today, with the exception that the research I'll talk about is NIH-funded work. So we talked a lot about behavioral economics throughout the day today. I thought I'd start and level set to sort of describe how I think about behavioral economics and what it means. And so I think at the broadest sense, what we're talking about is the impact of environmental and contextual determinants on the behavior of interest. And so that might be something like decision-making as an altered sensitivity to cost. We've talked a lot about demand today. That's why I think of it as in this bucket. How do people differ in their sensitivity to cost and how those differ over different contexts? The devaluation of future consequences. Greg talked about this in the context of discounting. Probably our most popular example from the behavioral economic literature, this devaluation of a consequence as a function of its delay to receipt. And then finally, this more molar idea of thinking in behavioral economics as decision-making as this alteration of alternatives in one environment, whether it's a relatively restricted environment, or impoverished one, or a relatively enriched one with many rich alternatives. And I think that one's particularly important when we think about the tobacco regulatory space and the tobacco space over the last 5-10 years. And so historically, we've had really one dominant product. Of course, we've had other things like cigars and pipe tobacco and other things, but the combustible cigarette was king, and the combustible cigarette had well-described, well-characterized, well-known risk associated with it. Sort of, for better or worse, objectively bad in a lot of ways. And over the last, I'd say 10, 15 years, we've seen the emergence of a number of different product categories. One we've talked about today a lot, e-cigarettes, which in and of itself is a dramatically changing product use category. You can tell this schematic is already out of date. We have new products emerging on the market all the time that differ in how they deliver. Caroline talked a lot today about all the various parameters that come into that. We've got oral nicotine products, so things like the Zens or other nicotine pouches. We've got also tobacco products that are meant to have modified risks. So, for example, the reduced nicotine cigarettes that Eric talked about, that subset of them are received a modified tobacco risk designation. And so we now have products that differ in these things, cost, the other alternatives available, the delay to their reward and consequence, and likely fall along this spectrum of harm. I put this up there as really a talking point. I don't think we have enough data to really say where these things lie on this spectrum. I think everyone in this room is going to have a different rank ordering or some very subtle variation. But I think what is important is we have to think about how different products lie across the spectrum of harm, from no nicotine, which is obviously the ideal, or probably the ideal for many of us, of a product not going into your body, to things like combustibles that have this well-characterized health impact. And of course, thinking about behavioral economics, a lot of that is going to be delayed and probabilistic. And so frankly, we don't know 40, 50 years. We can model it, but we don't know until 40, 50 years from now what some of these products that are newly emergent on the market, the risk that they might have. And so this is all to say, sort of, I think it's incumbent upon us to think about and have open-mindedness to evaluating both the benefits and harms related to this emergent class of tobacco products. I'll be focusing a lot, which is sort of unusual for me because I think fall more on the harm reduction-y side of some of these alternative products, thinking about harm-related effects of e-cigarettes, in particular the withdrawal syndrome that they might produce. And so I won't belabor the point of withdrawal. I think many speakers today, Dorothy in particular, have emphasized them. But when we think about withdrawal from tobacco cigarettes, and we think about withdrawal from tobacco in general, we know that it's related to a number of different classes and categories of symptoms. We've got sort of broadly those positively reinforcing effects that maintain behavior, positive affect. Jack apparently is the embodiment of. I'll start putting a little picture of Jack right next to positive affect now, and I think that will drive it home in everyone's head. And other positive effects of both pharmacological and behavioral effects associated with tobacco use. And then what we think of more commonly, when we think about withdrawal, these negative reinforcing effects, the alleviation of aversive states, things such as drug craving, the urge to smoke, negative affect, impaired cognition that comes with withdrawal that cigarettes alleviate, and then something we haven't really talked about much, but sleep disruption as well. That, of course, I actually never had the pleasure of meeting John. Of course, know his work quite well, and I think many of us rely upon his work for everything we do. But a lot of that comes from foundational work John did. One of the studies he did in recent years started to characterize this e-cigarette withdrawal syndrome in an outpatient setting, leveraging another big topic of this conference, contingency management, to have folks sustain abstinence in an outpatient setting and evaluate withdrawal when coming into the lab. And so those are the data plotted here. You see on the x-axis day, so baseline, a beginning of abstinence period and mean withdrawal levels. The dotted line on the top there is historical data under similar conditions with combustible users. So that's combustible cigarette withdrawal. The bottom two lines are people that used only e-cigarettes at the time of that study. The top being former combustible users, the bottom being never combustible. And so what you see is sort of this at least relatively modest withdrawal observed in both those who had former and never use. Not necessarily in contrast, but sort of in similarity or in parallel. These are some data from a collaborator at Hopkins, Tori Spindle, from work he did back at VCU, looking at the alleviation of craving and sort of these difficulty concentrating, so a subjective measure of cognition that came with e-cigarette use. So the x-axis is time, the y-axis is the scores on visual analog scales. And so what you've got here is folks coming in over overnight abstinence, using an e-cigarette under a directed bout. That's that 10-puff demarcation on the x-axis. And you see this alleviation of both e-cigarette craving and the difficulty concentrating, sort of a good ABA design, particularly on the left, where you see reduction followed by slow approach back to that baseline, followed by reduction with use. So suggestive that there's at least some sort of aversive state that's remedied through the use of an e-cigarette. So I'm going to spend the bulk of my time today is talking about an ongoing study we have. We've got an interim analysis given some of the pharmacokinetics measures that we're doing and initial measures that we've done with those. Evaluating e-cigarette withdrawal within a controlled residential setting. So the idea here is much like some of those foundational studies in tobacco cigarette use, is evaluating these features and facets of e-cigarette withdrawal in a controlled setting, sort of a tight temporal measurement and broad measurement across different facets. So what does that look like? So on the bottom here, you see some pictures of our clinical research unit. I think most of you know how residential units work, but we're talking about something that's sort of a hybrid between a hospital and a hotel, just much, much more expensive than a hotel, where you've got the ability to tightly monitor folks for 24 hours a day. So in this case, the ability to monitor and ensure that there's no other tobacco use going on, as well as having all the sort of tools and tricks that you can do to measure behavior, physiological effects throughout that period. We have folks stay for 1 week, so 8 days, 7 nights of monitored e-cigarette withdrawal, with sort of just a schematic overview here of the daily measurements. So we're collecting mood, cognition, pharmacodynamic measures like demand, or I guess not demand, pharmacodynamic. We're not giving a drug, but behavioral measures like demand, some kinetics. So we're looking at urinary clearance of both tobacco markers as well as toxicant and carcinogenic markers, and then sleep via actigraphy and EEG. I'll be focusing more on the left side of that today. If you're interested in sleep data, feel free to reach out to me. I just don't have it plotted up here. So the interim analysis I'm going to be talking from today is this initial 16-person sample that we did the sort of intensive urinary markers on. Something not plotted here, there is a randomization to a nicotine patch, placebo patch, or no patch condition. So I'll be plotting both in the group aggregate as well as those individual conditions. You can see demographic wise, young adult to middle age, so 21 to 45 range, 30 at average. Everyone in the study is exclusive daily e-cigarette use, so no other tobacco use allowed. It's also minimal cannabis use. They had to report using 2 or fewer days a week, which technically we don't have a urinary THC positive inclusion criteria, yes or no, but I think 14 of the 16 people had no biological evidence of cannabis use. And the reason there is we know that cannabis produces a fairly reliable withdrawal syndrome that could confound the measurement of e-cigarette withdrawal. And everyone, of course, being interested in a quit attempt. Dependence measure, this is the Penn State e-cigarette dependence questionnaire. If you don't know that, a number of 13 means absolutely nothing, but sort of going to the next slide. So 4 is considered mild, 9 is considered moderate, and 13 is considered severe or significant withdrawal, or sorry, not withdrawal, dependence. So on the left there, you're seeing that at baseline. On the right, what you're seeing is after the 1 week abstinence period, and then at the 1 week follow-up after being back in the real world in real world conditions for a week, where, as I'll talk about later, some people return to use, some people don't. So sort of a good demonstration manipulation check here. We see a reduction in at least self-reported dependence over that 1 week period, or sorry, 2 week period, 1 week of abstinence, 1 week of return to regular behavior, if you may. And we also see that that does relate to the amount of return to use in that week period after. So what you see is that greater changes in or greater reductions in dependence are related to fewer days of use in the week after. Sort of definitional in a sense. If you're using after, you're inherently probably more dependent, but a good proof of demonstration there. So I'll sort of walk through those different buckets of data today, both introducing how we measure them as well as the data from them. So first, subjective withdrawal. I apologize. I should have used the Minnesota nicotine withdrawal scale. That's a very bad form for the VCBH conference, but I'm going to present some data from the QSU. So many of you are familiar, but 2-factor scale, largely falling into those positive versus negative reinforcing effects relating to withdrawal and relating to the likelihood of return to use. And so if we look at the desire or that more positive scale, most of the graphs I'll present today are going to look like this. On the x-axis, you've got the day and the residential unit. On the y, you've got the score, the measure. In this case, it's the total score. The full range of that measure is 5 to 35. So we're looking at the full range here. And so what we see is in the group aggregate, you see this sort of initial withdrawal increase that flattens out over the first 2 to 3 days, that slowly decreases by day 8 or that discharge date. It looks, I think, relatively modest, but I'll note that that's a shift from about 20, 21 up to the 25s down to about 15 by the end. So full scale, so we're seeing about a 10-point swing overall. Similar pattern, smaller magnitude or lower baseline and the QSU relief, so that's at negative affect. This sort of, at least in our hands, is consistent. The QSU negative, QSU relief, QSU avoidance, whatever term you want to use, tends to be rather lower, but again, we see the same sort of pattern with peaks over those first couple of days. Simple measure of drug craving, you see an initial spike that's sustained over a couple of days. In this case, e-cigarette craving is the drug craving that remits over that 1 week period. I mentioned I'd show by condition. These are not going to be particularly interesting because these are going to be much smaller cell sizes. But at least in terms of patterning, what we're seeing is there's really no clear differences amongst the groups, except perhaps somewhat of a placebo effect in the placebo patch condition. You see that in the top right, where the no patch condition is showing sort of the highest QSU relief. That also could be we're small cell sizes here at this point, so that could just be a randomization thing. I think what's more interesting is mapping all of this onto the post-discharge behavior. So in that 1 week period, whether people return to regular use or report a reduction or complete abstinence from e-cigarettes. And so what we see is that really maps on sort of quite nicely onto the pattern of behavior during the residential period, where you see for both the withdrawal measures as well as the craving measures, sort of a more prototypic and a remitted withdrawal pattern in the reducer abstainer groups versus those who sustain use. Really see just the sustained and higher level of both withdrawal measurements as well as drug craving or e-cigarette craving throughout that period. So taken together, we see somewhat modest, but sort of a nice withdrawal time course, as well as a relationship between that and the likelihood or propensity to return to regular use after that week period. We're here talking about behavioral economics, so I figured you all would humor me for a minute to get into some demand stuff. I'll spend more time talking about how we measure demand here than I'll talk about the actual demand data, but bear with me. So we've talked a lot about demand today already. Simply this relationship between the consumption of a good and its cost. Matt put it nicely earlier in talking about how I think demand really provides us this multidimensional measure of reinforcement where we can separate things like demand intensity, consumption at unconstrained cost, or demand elasticity, price sensitivity. And you can see differing relationships across the demand curve depending on where you're looking. We talked about goods that are relatively inelastic like gas, goods that are relatively elastic or price sensitively like candy. But I think it was Eric who mentioned earlier the really important point that these are not intrinsic properties of the commodities themselves. Reinforcement demand is a complex interplay between the biological or the chemical constituents of the thing you're talking about, the biological nature of the organism, and the context in which you're in. So candy is a great example this time of the year. For a small child, candy is probably more inelastic. And for us right now, candy is more inelastic than it typically is. It's Halloween coming up, and we're willing to spend a lot more than we typically would. I was out in Lexington. Those of you who know Mike Bardo, apparently Mike is also like a small child and very inelastic when it comes to candy. I didn't know this, but I was talking about this, and Mike was just like, when I said candy was elastic, he was like, it's like, I guess small children and Mike. It goes without saying, and actually Matt presented some of these data earlier from the purchase task. Warren was instrumental, I think, in kicking off the ability to do additional work with demand in varied contexts and varied spaces. So traditionally, demand was measured using operant behavior involving effortful responding, lever pulls, lever presses, much like what we do in the rodent laboratory. And that's great and that's wonderful, but that's very time intensive. It also requires the actual delivery of the drug. The purchase test allows us to do simulated procedures, instructional vignettes. We've talked about these today. I think that's, and just to sort of emphasize that, this is from under review, looking at the trajectory of purchase tests over the last 20 years, and you see this really kind of taken up in our major drug classes. What's nice about the purchase tasks in our context is we're talking about withdrawal. We're talking about the intentional and experimental removal of drug. So we don't want to be giving drug to people. It's simply to measure reinforcement and reward. This allows us a way to look at that over the withdrawal time course. Just to sort of hammer home the value of these tasks in e-cigarette use, I was glad to see puffs. Caroline, you present puffs. I think puffs are a nice way of thinking about e-cigarettes across different product categories. We've done some work showing those are test-retest reliable, which is great, and that they map onto dependence measures such as the time to first e-cigarette use in the morning, greater demand intensity, lower demand elasticity or less price sensitivity, greater dependence. So that was the long-winded way to introduce all this. Here is some data from the first day on the residential unit. What you see in the sort of darker, and then I guess you can see, and the sort of lighter lines are the individual traces. The darker is the population curve. And so what you see is over the course of day 1, day 3, day 7, we actually see a slight flattening of the curve. So suggesting that despite the withdrawal measures showing that sort of remitting time course, we're seeing more inelastic demand over that 7-day period. By day 7, a more inelastic or less price sensitive demand function relative to day 1. We do see some differences as a function of those assigned conditions. Again, small sample sizes here, so I wouldn't take too much from it. But what this does suggest is, again, that placebo-like effect where the no patch condition is showing the more inelastic demand, but maybe a baseline difference as well. Getting to the sort of the main data here, or the main thing to talk about with this interim analysis, we've done in-depth pharmacokinetic data on both nicotine clearance as well as some of the toxicant and carcinogenic markers that we traditionally look at in tobacco use. So first, cotinine. So I do have this one split up, and just split up by group. We would expect a nicotine patch to result in consistent nicotine. So collapsing them makes it look real funky because it looks like this. So you see clear and consistent clearance of cotinine in the placebo and no patch conditions. I really like these data because they suggest we did a good job on the residential unit of monitoring tobacco use. So we're not seeing any evidence of sort of either, contraband tobacco use versus the nicotine condition where we see a nicotine patch where we see that consistent level of cotinine. We do have measures of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. So those are your two main vehicles in e-cigarettes. And so what you see on the left there is the group aggregate. On the right is the by drug, by condition. So what we see is clearance of PG over those first couple of days, a pretty rapid clearance. What I'll note is it's non-zero because there is PG in foods. Same with vegetable glycerin. So you're going to find some of that. But this does suggest that that amount is probably at least an order of magnitude lower than what you observe sort of in regular daily use. I don't know why I didn't put it in here. The individual traces, though, you do see a lot of heterogeneity in terms of this, in terms of both the baseline as well as the rate of clearance, which is represented somewhat in those error bars. VG, we see a similar story, although a little bit messier, where you see some clearance, but it sort of stabilizes at a higher level relative to at least the baseline levels. And then just finally, a couple of markers of potential toxicants or carcinogens, so HPMA. What we see is at baseline, elevated levels relative to those days of cessation, declines rather rapidly. This is consistent with, I think, tobacco use in general, but we do see detectable levels that are higher than a no-use level in the baseline samples. Similar with one hop, so we see a consistent decrease over the 7-day period and elevated, although not as dramatically as HPMA. Final data point, so just to sort of hammer home the relationship between some of these kinetic markers and withdrawal. So on the base, the x-axis here, you're looking at baseline cotinine, which is probably both a measure of nicotine exposure, of course, but also just general use. So I don't think we can separate those two things. On the y-axis, you're looking at peak withdrawal for our two subjective measures. And what you see is that there's, albeit small sample correlations, so take it with a grain of salt, but sort of expected correlations between greater e-cigarette use and greater withdrawal observed over that 7-day period. So just big take-homes, preliminary data indicating mild to moderate subjective withdrawal peaking in that 1 to 3 day window post-cessation. That said, subjective withdrawal is associated with a return to use post-cessation. That it appears to be at least nicotine exposure or e-cigarette amount exposure dependent. And that we see clearance of toxin and carcinogenic metabolites over a 7-day period, although they are observed at that baseline, suggesting that there's at least something going on. I didn't have the forethought or the insight or the goodness to plot what we see on average with tobacco combustibles. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind too. So the relative amount that's being seen, but we're of course still seeing it, which is important. Many people to thank, in particular, Tori Spindle, who's an MPI on this this project with me, and our staff who help run things. Those of you who don't know, I'm moving over to University of Maryland. So if you're interested in basic science work, we're looking for folks, particularly preclinical folks. So if you or trainees are interested, feel free to chat with me about that. And my contact is here, and hopefully stay approximately on time for questions.
Thanks for that wonderful talk and series of talks. I'd like to invite our presenters to come up, and we have plenty of time for questions. So.
Oh, the panel's there. You know, I want to reflect rather than asking questions. I want to reflect because this meeting is about the history of behavioral pharmacology, and I want to reflect about the contribution that behavioral pharmacology has made to this field of tobacco dependence. Come on, there was a time not so long ago when over half the population smoked, right? Right. If you don't believe that, go watch the old movies where people are, all the actors are lighting up their cigarettes one after another. And then all of a sudden, the public health folks recognized the link between smoking and lung cancer. That was kind of a shocker, right? Because people thought smoking was just a bad habit. You know, it was just some fun little bad habit that people had. Okay, so recognize that link. And about the same, around the same time, the same era, when behavioral pharmacology started flourishing. So, and asking the question, why are all these people smoking? What is it about these cigarettes? And so then we had people recognizing or studying both the negative reinforcement effects, Dorothy, John, and the positive reinforcing. And those demonstrations of the positive reinforcing effects of nicotine, even though it may not be quite as potent as cocaine, I think were hugely important. You know, the Surgeon General's report and so forth. When Johns Hopkins Hospital went smoke-free in the 70s, I think, or was it the 80s, maybe early 80s. I knew something big was happening. You know, that it was like, oh my God, all of our health providers are smoking cigarettes. They're smoking this lethal product. Now, all of a sudden, the healthcare system is starting to recognize that this behavior should be stopped. So that was something big that happened. Now, the battle didn't, science contributed hugely, but it was a team effort to get where we are today. Where we are today is that the rate of smoking has gone down to 11%, which is a huge sea change, the whole attitude about smoking. So it's like it's been a huge public health triumph, and behavioral pharmacology was at the crux of it at the beginning. And guess what? So there's still 28 million people smoking. That's still a lot. But behavioral pharmacology has the answer for putting the final nail in the coffin, and that's the reduced nicotine cigarettes. You've got the beautiful data to support the efficacy of that approach. I won't go on anymore, but the only other public health triumph that even equals this, rivals it, I think, is development of the COVID vaccine. This, you know, what our field has done to contribute to this issue is huge. Thank you.
So I just want to say, Eric, your talk was brilliant. I think that sort of multidimensional analysis really putting us, orienting us towards what all of the data are saying and all those relevant dimensions that you have to really step through to really evaluate a huge decision about whether this, such a policy decision should be made. So I thought that's exactly the way I think we should all be. I wish society would be thinking about how we should orient towards such a huge decision like this. And, particularly inclusion, this question about the black market, which is something that's sort of the thing that sticks for me. Like, what are we, and I just, look at this, and you brought the alcohol example, and there's a lot of differences I think are important. It's like, the addictive substance itself is not the toxicant. So huge difference. So suggesting that, it's completely dependent on how we handle these alternatives, which thankfully we have. And so one of the things that makes me a little pessimistic that we can like thread this needle correctly is that, gosh, the sentiment around it, it's so difficult, especially with the kids and, you know, all of these alternative products, not only e-cigarettes, but then also I think of more recently the pouches, the non-tobacco pouches, the nicotine pouches. And I think, yes, you know, none of these are safe, but gosh, in the scheme of things, I mean, basically the pouch is a superior delivery system than all of the, you know, approved forms of nicotine replacement. And it's, you know, has been, you know, widely adopted so quickly. And what gives me, you know, some pessimism is just the over-regulation that seems to be continuing of these other products. And I don't mean that I wish there was more regulation in terms of the safety and the, you know, the constituents that go into them, but the overregulation in terms of the reinforcing effects, you know, that making them less likable. So the flavors, you know, big one. So I've become really concerned with the various bands of the flavors without recognizing, wow, we've got to really make have a balance here. And if we want these to be attractive products, you know, if we want these to be substitutes for combustible tobacco smoking, if we don't want a massive black market, and we want to minimize that to the degree possible, if a nicotine reduction mandate is in place, we're going to need these to be fairly attractive. And so I guess, I mean, the most extreme thing is, I don't know if it's only California, where they've even banned flavors for the nicotine pouches. And I just step back and think this is madness. I mean, it's completely understandable. Of course, you know, none of us want our kids to adopt any of these products, but you look at this context where you have every year, you know, thousands of teenagers are going to be adopting some of these products. We would rather at the population level have some of these products, you know, as less risky alternatives. So I don't know, maybe you can provide some thoughts on that. How do you have any confidence that we can, you know, thread this needle correctly such that we do appropriately regulate something like nicotine pouches as an alternative so that, you know, a potential nicotine reduction mandate can actually be successful and that we can, you know, keep a potential black market at bay?
Big question, Matt. Is that on? Am I on? Okay. So a couple of thoughts. So one is that if you look at the market as it currently stands, it's hard to tell it's regulated, right? At least in the vaping space, right? So, you know, we talk a lot about regulatory restrictions and how it impacts the market. But the reality is the products are far more diverse than the regulated market would suggest. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. I do have some confidence that we can, quote unquote, thread this needle. And part of it comes from just a sense of the kind of broader historical trend. We are slowly moving, I believe, away from the combusted product. The question is, how fast do we get there? And I see the regulation as a tool to expedite that process. That's why I see time as a critical variable. So I think that the environment, the context, the products that are available, it's possible to do it. What I'm kind of unsatisfied doing is waiting for it to happen without some push. And so I do think the world's changed in a way that products that are substitutable are there. And there is the potential for regulatory structure to put some guideposts around that. I do worry that if we overextend and try to do everything at once, we will get nothing done. And so I do think that some prioritization of reducing, of kind of where I started the talk. What is the priority? And for me, the priority is tobacco and harm. But we have to decide as a society that's the priority too. I mean, that I got one vote out of a lot of people. So you know, I have some hope, but I'm an optimist at heart. So
not to wade into a state versus federal rights of regulation, but I do think a lot of it is complicated by, you brought up the California example, and anecdote is king. I was in Kentucky this weekend, and I was with someone that was from California, and they were excited to get flavors. They use Zen pouches, but they said they've got a guy back at home who sells flavors out of his car, who goes to other states and gets them. And so I bring it up as the example of, I think, until we have at least from my perspective, a strong federal policy on a lot of this stuff, you always run the leaky lit. Like the black market becomes more of an issue when there's a state 50 feet away from you, 50 miles away from you that has a different policy. So for me, at least, that's the other challenge, is getting CTP, getting FDA, getting the sort of the national voice on board to push forward policy that impacts everyone equally.
Yeah, and I also think that enough hasn't been done in terms of what are some other factors that might minimize the appeal of the product for youth. It could be the packaging, it could be the promotion, it could be the placement of the products. And so I think we do need to do a little bit more research in terms of, are there other variables that we can control, or other factors that we can control that might minimize the appeal of the product without necessarily restricting all the various flavors of the various alternative non-combustive products.
That's a comment. Quick comment on the flavors, and Matt, good points and great points. But FDA, which is very cautious, very conservative, between Zin and Swedish Match, approved a bunch of flavors. They determined that it was in the public health interest to have flavors for their products. I think with respect to ends, they are still so scared that they're not going to do it, but they did the obvious with respect to those.
Yeah, and I think there are some electronic cigarette companies that are thinking about how to make the device in such a fashion, especially if you have flavored products, that, biometrics or something that would only be able to operate if you have the right biometrics, if you're, an adult, and you initiate it with your whatever biometrics that you have, and then that would minimize the chance that you might be using a product.
I was curious, this is probably mostly directed to Eric, since you had the guts to go up there and speculate and lay out your thoughts. Current policy climate, what do you think the chances are that anything's going to be done with this? I mean, I have a habit, I spent my career working on things that never get used, so.
As I said, Steve, I consider you a mentor. I actually had a slide that I cut out that said this talk is not about, and it was exactly that, predicting, whether or not it's likely to happen. I'm just not going to entertain that question. I think that I'm not, and because it should, and all I can do is put data behind that argument and talk about it. And I don't make the decision as to whether or not a policy moves forward. My job as a scientist is to put the data forward. And so I over a beer, you'll get a different answer out of me probably, but that's my cop out.
I think, joking aside, I mean, that's how I feel about contingency management. Oh, I could do cocaine. You spend years working on effective treatment and people just walk right by it while complaining about how bad the latest uptick is in stimulant use disorder. So, we can only do our part. And so I'm proud to be part of the nicotine reduction. But I just thought, given you that you were thinking about all this,
I still believe
curious what your thoughts, and maybe even scuttlebutt. We know that there were dramatic changes at the FDA, including the CTP. So I don't know, maybe anybody in the room who wants to speculate, but I completely agree that we have a job to do, and we've done it on this product.
Yeah, yeah, to some extent, I disagree. I mean.
It's okay.
But yeah, for a while there, I really felt that we are scientists. We produce the data, and it should be someone else that takes it into policy. But I think that's, I don't think that's the case. I think someone has to be an advocate. Someone has to really take it to the next step. And sometimes it lands on us if we
Yeah.
really have this belief that this is the approach that we should take.
Yeah, I definitely didn't mean to give that impression. I completely, as usual, Dorothy and I actually do agree, which is why we like working together. It is, we can't be totally silent on this, but I'm still just one voice. You have to, I mean, part of what I want to do is engage other people in the same conversation. That NPRM closed. The question would be how many people commented on the NPRM in support of it or not. Like, we have to be part of the discussion and bring the data to that discussion.
Before I get to my comment on nicotine reduction on that, channeling John Hughes again, when we were trying to get nicotine gum and patch that FDA would just approve, and pharmaceutical companies wanted it, and they were aligned with Slade and Ken Warner and others that said harm reduction approaches for people that want it or need it. And FDA made the burden so high that the companies walked away from it. And John Hughes just said, this is crazy. People are smoking cigarettes. We're talking about saying, switch to something that is light years less dangerous. It was crazy. And a couple of years ago, on Steve's suggestion, we did a little paper on errors of omission and commission. And a lot of public health people are just scared to death that we do something that, oh my God, we're going to let people use nicotine gum longer? What's going to happen? Part of the magic of Surgeon General Koop is, guess what? He was a surgeon. If you stick a knife in somebody, that's really risky. But if you're a surgeon and the baby, in his case, is going to die, you do it, you act. You don't say, but I can't do it because, anyway, in public health, we're hamstrung by fear that we're going to do something. And so we do nothing while people die. Anyway, on nicotine reduction, just a quick perspective. When Neil and I were taking an hour-long run because we got lost in wherever we were, Glasgow or Warsaw, I think Glasgow. It was a response to the FDA commissioner that said, what's the threshold for nicotine addiction in a cigarette? And we kind of put it together and just got that out. But then when people were taking it seriously, the American Medical Association commissioned me to lead a group on how do you actually do it. So John Slade, Neil Benowitz, a number of other people, we all worked together. And we said, really, it's only viable if you need a lot of education, you need alternatives, because the premise was there would be some people that need a place to go. And it's not that you're promoting nicotine, it's the reality. And having said that, I think we always have to make every effort to deter minors, young people, from starting. If they, a lot of us, me and Neil, face this with our own kids who smoked. So my kids probably knew more about smoking than a lot of professionals. And so I didn't lecture and beat them. I said, ABC, anything but a cigarette and I'll pay for it. Anyway, to make nicotine reduction work, I think we do need alternatives. And what I have said to the people, that whether you support nicotine reduction or oppose it, you should be in favor of satisfying alternatives, as FDA mentioned, because if it drives down, if we drive smoking down to, let's say, a couple percent with alternatives, you lose the incentive. You don't need to do nicotine reduction.
Give you a chance to respond. I don't know if you want to respond to what Jack just said before I say something.
I mean, I'll say just a quick word. This issue of is it necessary versus sufficient is an important one to consider. And it relates back to what your goals are. So if your goals are, you see a pattern that you think that the availability of alternatives will drive down prevalence at a rate that you're willing to accept, then you don't infringe on the market. If you think that you need to infringe on the market to achieve your goals and get there, then I think it's a different equation. Jack, come on.
Just going back to Warner Sweener, or Warner Sladen Sweener, 1997. And basically it was the concept of satisfying nicotine alternatives, which they said would be really crazy to some people. But there are people that their goal is anti-nicotine, drive nicotine out. A lot of us said, if your goal is end, and as much as we can, tobacco-associated death and disease, well, then a lot of us are saying nicotine has a place in that equation. But what is your goal?
Well, what is my goal? Is to reduce death and disease, and that's why Eric and I have been working on that. But, whether one of the questions is whether we even need reduced nicotine proposed rule if there are appealing, alternatives. That's the question. And I think some of the studies that we've done, it seems to show, and some of the studies that it seems to show that you will facilitate the selection of alternatives if you have a very low nicotine content cigarette, situation versus a normal nicotine content condition. And so the question is, how soon do you want the death and disease to go down, right? I mean, yeah.
Just two quick comments. One is I agree with Dorothy about advocacy. I'm all in. So anything I said was not to suggest otherwise. Yeah, I agree with you completely. The other one is, as scientists, our audience is global. So, suppose the US, policymaker decides not to move forward with nicotine reduction, the evidence may move some other companies. So we've been working for more than 20 years on CM for perinatal smoking cessation. Not even in Vermont have they used it, but England is moving forward. They have moved forward. So, yeah.
This is a quick question building off of comments Steve made. So while we continue to advocate for the VLNC policy, we have this strong body of evidence in support of VLNC cigarettes. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as to whether there's any role for VLNC cigarettes in tobacco treatment to augment existing treatments, especially in populations historically more difficult to treat, that we could start to use now in clinical settings.
Pick a number.
Yes. I think so. I think we've not explored that nearly enough. It's been tricky from a regulatory perspective to get that going, because if you think about cigarettes as safe and effective in that pathway, it doesn't seem like a viable test for a cessation. But I think there are ways to get around that issue and to essentially prepare someone for a quit attempt that's supported through other means. We're trying to go down that road a little bit now. But I think it's, now that they're on the market, it's an important point.
No, I totally agree. And Eli, I think you did some work with that, right? looking at very low nicotine content versus reducing the
No.
number of cigarettes
Yeah.
smoked, and found that the reduction in nicotine content was the better approach.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the little work I've done and some other secondary analyses, correct me if I'm wrong, but often was with the intention among people who didn't intend to quit at the outset, not in a treatment setting, and a regulatory context where post hoc we examined cessation outcomes. But it does seem like there's promise there.
No, I agree. We just need the research to show that. I think.
Yeah, and I think what's the claim that would be made in an MRTP setting? And it's something like, reduces your dependence on a cigarette and may facilitate your ability to abstain or something, but you can't make a quick efficacy claim through a CTP channel. So there's a balancing act there in terms of testing, I think.
I'll start with the disclosure. I've worked most of my career with non-US government in tobacco control, and we've used a lot of your work in science, addiction science, flavors, and so on. So yes, you are not totally ignored. Your work is being used somewhere else. The track record for the FDA, US FDA, in terms of regulatory action is pretty poor. So I will risk saying, speculating that nicotine reduction in the US is not probably for their shortcoming or the next 10 years. I could be wrong. So continuing in a non-US environment, I think you were somewhat consulted by New Zealand when they had their proposal on nicotine reduction. I think you and Dorothy were at the European SRNT meeting where pros and cons were discussed about the nicotine reduction. So I'm going to ask you not to speculate, but to tell me or to tell us what you think are the barriers for adoption or at least consideration of a nicotine reduction in the rest of the world outside of the US.
So I was lucky enough to get involved with some of the New Zealand work and have good colleagues down there and still have an ongoing research down there. It derailed. So for folks that don't know, New Zealand passed a law to actually implement nicotine reduction. It was on the books to be implemented. I believe it's March of this year of 2025. So it would have been implemented at this point. I can't remember if that's the exact date. And then the government turned over and politics shifted and they repealed that law. They are facing a new election soon and there's some discussion of it coming back. So politics, again, this is hard to predict. Why did it get derailed? Some of it was, my understanding is some of it was really kind of turning towards alternative, less invasive approaches, less things like starting to provide more alternatives and which already were available in New Zealand. There was a gun shyness to that. I can tell you there's still the idea of compensatory smoking that is, no matter what the data say, is still, a myth that steers, biases people's opinions. It is, it's not all science. There's some politics in here and about, choice and what does it mean to have choice that is interpreted in different ways.
Yeah, I think it's the personal choice issue and also the illicit. There's just that big fear that there's going to be a huge illicit market. And so I think that's the other factor that's deterring some governments from moving forward.
Just wanted to say I loved how you at first asked us, whether we need the results. And I think I was the first to raise my hand thinking, oh, well, they're going to definitely, do a lot more of it since they're not getting enough, So thank you very much. I think nicotine reduction strikes me as the most exciting thing out there. And I know there is some interest in this in Vermont. So one, I'm going to be the broken record, do it again, American Cancer Society, all that. But the thing is that if you pair that with Tang's research out of New York University, where, as he said in his paper, we don't know if nicotine vapes cause cancer in humans, but we definitely know for mice that that's the case. And he's identified a novel pathway. It's independent of the pathway that cigarettes cause cancer. And so what we may be seeing with this great increase, if you're dual users, are synergistic effects, not just additive. So there's that. People who can talk to that even better than I are the Department of Health is having another series, and on the 20th of this month, I can share this poster, but we'll be having two people talking specifically. Dr. Jort, his the toxicity and public health risks of new tobacco products, a moving target. So I invite everybody to come check that out. And then lastly, I guess this is finally the question after all those statements. I worked some with Dr. Anna Rule, her lab is at Johns Hopkins. And really, epidemiology is the queen of all this, right? And the epidemiology is pretty strong, I would say. But the theoretical toxicology aspect really, I think, strikes at the heart of the concept of like, where do we place e-cigarettes on that continuum that you had? And I think it's not, yes, we should be open, but the problem is that Dr. Anna Rule's lab discovered that there are 2,000 unknown unique chemicals in a vape aerosol, right? We don't even know what they are. Unless you knew what those were, you couldn't possibly, using a logic model, say where you're going to place e-cigarettes on that continuum. And with those acute effects that I was previously talking about, the arrhythmia, the case studies that I'm talking about are 22-year-olds who have heart attacks from non-nicotine vape. It's not a contamination of the data. It's, I know case studies are case studies, but they're, so the acute effects, and again, in Vermont, we've seen hundreds of lung injuries continuing. So the acute effects of cigarettes, if you were just looking at those, the question becomes, could they be considered more harmful than cigarettes? If they're causing, if the mouse data is correct, and you get people dying and having heart attacks in a much shorter time period than cigarettes could ever cause, right? Like you don't smoke for a month and then have a heart attack. But with vaping, we have case studies where that's the case. So after all that, I'm a little bit nervous. What I'm trying to say is how, with any assuredness, can we talk about them being harm reduction when this much is known? Like we can talk about maybe, but really they can't be equated with harm reduction with any strength. However, the Zyn strikes me as very interesting, right? You're not taking in heavy metals, formaldehyde, ketene, God knows, or acreolin, long list, right? And it's also not going into the lungs, it's going into a digestive pathway, completely different situation. So that strikes me as possible, though some of my colleagues would be aghast that I'm suggesting that Zyn might be harm reduction. At any rate, I'll sit back down.
No, I mean, I appreciate your comments. I really, I would say I agree with Caroline on how I view this, that I intentionally tried to point out that all of this has to be data driven. And if there are data that are moving our estimates about harm, then of course we have to attend to the full body of data and try to integrate that with our decision making. Absolutely. The other side of what you said was precaution. It is the unknown part. And while I understand precautionary principles, I also think that we have to be careful about precaution leading to inaction.
Absolutely. But again, epidemiology is the real queen.
Agreed.
Right? And so that's back to the American Cancer Society page, you know.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit confused about that the research that you suggest in terms of cancer risk.
Yeah.
Some of the people that are have used electronic cigarettes, if they're older, they probably have had a history of smoking. And so, you know, the question is whether it's that history of smoking that has enhanced that rate, or is it just the electronic cigarette itself? Because
Right.
if you're just talking about electronic cigarettes, solely exclusive use of electronic cigarette, then you're talking about a younger population, and oftentimes you don't see the, you know, occurrence of lung cancer until many years later. And so I'm a little bit confused in terms of what, you know,
Right.
whether that's a study that is kind of the
Again,
validity, you know, is valid. Yeah.
I would, person better to answer that would be the American Cancer Society than myself as to why they've incorporated that into their page. But the flip side is that you'd assume that some of those people who are dual users have reduced their cigarette use.
Oh, you're talking about dual users.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
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 I think that's also, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no. Go
I was going to say, I mean, I think with a lot of this, I agree with Eric. And I think your point is a really strong one of we're constantly moving that lever of where it is. And I think is the devil is always in things like the dose and the actual drug that's exposed. So I think back to not to use it as a counterexample alone, but back in 2019, 2020, there was immense concern about e-cigarettes given the emergence of popcorn lung and other the Avali e-cigarette associated lung, I forget the exact acronym, that was then traced back to vitamin E acetate and
Acetates, that's a debate, right? So we have, sorry to interrupt.
no, I was just gonna say, so I think we need to think about the regulatory markets, the products that are on it. Eric's point is wonderful in that what is regulated is not what you go to the corner shop and you see every possible e-cigarette product under the sun. And so I think it's a challenge of the nuance of that. I see Eli.
Yeah, sorry. This is a great discussion. I don't think this is on, but a great discussion. Thank you all for sticking around. We have a poster session starting right now, so I'd encourage everyone to have there. Thank you.